Welcome everyone from a rainy Villanova, and I am absolutely delighted to see so many people join this event. I hope that you will find it illuminating. Unfortunately, though I wish we were able to do so, we aren't going to be able to predict the outcome of this terrible situation, when peace will return to Ukraine. But we hope, in keeping with the Lepage Center's mission, to shed the light of history, both distant history and recent history, on current events, and leave you all understanding at least a little bit better how this tragic situation came to be. I am joined by a very, very able and accomplished group of panelists who represent different disciplines and also different age groups. I'm going to let them introduce themselves rather than spend any unnecessary time giving you long, boring introductions about our participants. And so without further ado, please let me introduce our first panelist, Professor Lynne Harnett, my colleague and friend in the Villanova History Department. Lynn.
Thank you, Adele. So thank you everyone for joining us. This is, first of all, let me say, my name is Lynne Harnett. I teach Russian history in the History Department of Villanova. I'm the graduate director of the graduate program at Villanova. And I've published on revolutionary history in Russia, and I teach on refugees from the Russian Empire, which unfortunately now we're seeing a new refugee crisis unfold, and revolutionary history, as well as a core class for our undergraduate students on Russia as an empire. So, should I continue or should we?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Each panelist introduce themselves as they begin to speak. Thanks, Lynn. Please go ahead.
So I feel a little awkward because up until 2 weeks ago, I didn't think that this was going to happen. As we read about things in the news and as the Biden administration warned about the troops gathered on Ukraine's border and into Belarus, I really couldn't conceive that this was going to happen. And I think what happened was I fell prey to my own suspicions about the legitimacy of what Putin was alleging. So for a long time, Putin has, especially even before the annexation of Crimea in 2014, talked about the idea of Russia and Ukraine and the Russians and Ukrainians being one people. And for a lot of what I thought was that this was just him kind of selling a justification for his geopolitical aspirations. And as we've watched this horror unfold in the last 2 weeks, I can only come to the conclusion that he actually believes it. One of the things that is often said about Vladimir Putin is that he sees, from one of his quotes, he sees the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And I think for a long time, what that did was it made many observers think that Putin was concerned with trying to recreate a Soviet empire. I don't believe that's the case. I think he is interested in recreating the Russian Empire. I think he is interested in creating this concept that he and others call Ruski Mir, right? This idea that there is a common history, culture, and civilization that joins the people of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia together. And while that might seem innocuous, it certainly is not in his hands. And part of that is because ever since the 17th century, Russia's relationship with Ukraine has been an imperial one. It has been a relationship of quintessential imperialism, where these were not equal partners. They were, Russia was the metropole to Ukraine's colony, and Russia, for the most part, treated Ukraine that way. There's so much history I could cover here, but I just want to try to highlight a few critical moments, since the Lepage Center is focused on turning points. So I just want to try to situate ourselves in a few different historical junctures. The first is one that you've probably heard about. It came about in 1654 when the Russians and the people who live in present-day Ukraine signed this treaty. And for the Russians, they saw this as a moment where they reclaimed Ukrainian lands as part of the Russian Empire. The Ukrainians and the Cossacks saw this as something much different. They saw this as a temporary military arrangement of protectorate. But what happened here in this moment, I think we see this way that history and ideas become contested and argumentative, depending on one's perspective. So from this moment forward, Russia looked at Ukraine as Little Russia, right, to the Great Russia. And even in that language, we can see this inequitable relationship, this vertical hierarchy that Moscow and then later St. Petersburg established. And this concept was just continued and permeated through the 18th century, through leaders that even casual observers of Russian history might know of, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And what happened was these czars who were expansionists, who believed that the way that their state and their empire would thrive would be through the expansion and conquest and inclusion of other peoples into their territory, left the people of present-day Ukraine co-opted into this empire. And even when we look at some of the language that these Russian czars used, we see echoes of things that Putin says today. So for example, after Catherine the Great in 1783 annexed Crimea and extended Russian territory into areas that she called Novorossiya, or New Russia, she had a coin minted, right, that basically said, you know, thank God that we have reclaimed what was ours, what was lost to us. And I think that idea really demonstrates the way that Russians have looked to Ukraine as something to be supportive of the larger Russian mission. In the 19th century, right after the wars of Napoleon, we saw the rising of nationalism. But in Russia, the Tsar at the time believed in this mystical mission of Russia. And what happened was the Russian Tsars of Alexander I and Nicholas I created this idea of what was called official nationality, which was rooted in autocracy and orthodoxy and nationality. And what they tried to do early in 1830, in the 1830s and 1840s, is they tried to create Kyiv as this place of that could be a bastion of Russian nationalism, right? So as ideals of nationalism were spreading through Western Europe, the Russians tried to create universities and publishing houses in Kiev that would promote Russianness. But what happened was the Ukrainians had a different idea, and it became this hotbed of budding Ukrainian nationalism within the throes of this romantic movement of nationalism in the 19th century. And what this does is it puts the Russians and Ukrainians in this collision course that will continue through the 19th century. So as there were uprisings in Polish lands in 1863, the Russians responded, and by this point we have a czar who's called the Tsar Liberator, respond by banning publishing in the Ukrainian language, by closing publishing houses, by making it illegal to eventually import any books of Ukrainian into in the Ukrainian language into the Russian Empire. And there was a moment in 1876 when Tsar Alexander II said something that is eerily similar to what Putin says today. In 1876, this is soon after the balance of power in Europe is shifting with the unification of Italy and, more importantly, Germany. And what Alexander II said in that moment was that the Russians needed to keep a firm control on Ukraine or Little Russia, because, as he said, to permit the separation of 13 million Little Russians from the empire, from the Russian Empire, as the Germanic tribe was expanding, would be the height of folly. And in this way, I think we can see alignment with ideas of Putin today. This idea that Ukraine has always been this bridge between Europe and Russia, between Europe and Eurasia. But for both Alexander II, other czars, and for Putin, I think it's looked upon as a gateway, something to be used to ensure that ideals of European liberalism for today, democracy, nationalism apart from the Russian nationalist project, are kept out of this Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, and now to a certain extent, Putin's empire.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Our next guest comes to us from Tufts University, Professor Oksana Chevelle. We're very pleased that you can join us. Dr. Chevelle is, as she will explain in her brief introduction, a leading expert on Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Dr. Chevelle.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join the panel. I'm a political scientist. I teach at Tufts University. I'm originally from Ukraine. I grew up there and went to college there before moving to first UK and then US for graduate school. My work has been broadly on Ukrainian nation building. I have published on topics of citizenship, migration. My most recent interest is in actually Orthodox politics in Ukraine. So I'm looking forward to discussing that aspect as well if we have time. But I was asked to comment on sort of evolution of Ukrainian identity since especially 1991. So I'll limit my introductory remarks to that. So just to follow up on what Professor Hartnett was saying, this idea that, you know, Ukraine and Russia are the same people, it was there for a long time, but it was never a dominant idea. It was never sort of this sentiment was never quite fully widespread and shared by the Ukrainian elites and the public. In the Soviet period, there was also this great duality. On the one hand, Soviet Union promoted this policy of nativization or Korenizatsiya, where they basically assigned ethnic identity to different groups. You know, these groups were often arbitrarily constructed, or, you know, the geography was drawn pretty much on the map by the Soviet leaders. Putin harps on this in his speech, pre-invasion speech, to kind of make the point that Ukraine was artificial construct. But what we forget to mention, that the very reason Lenin engaged in these kinds of policies was exactly the strength of Ukrainian nationalism after the Bolshevik Revolution. And it was only after short-lived attempt at Ukrainian independence was crushed by the Red Army, then as a way to sort of, you know, bring in these nationalist Ukrainians, Lenin adopts actually this policy. And of course, you know, that's, you know, I think that's an important element. So it was, you know, action-reaction kind of thing. It wasn't just Lenin coming out, you know, of the blue making these decisions. He was responding to very strong Ukrainian mobilization during the war. Then, of course, you know, in the course of the Soviet period, there were great suffering in Ukraine, most notably the killer famine of the 1932-33. In Ukraine is known as the Holodomor. It has been a taboo in the Soviet period, and since it began to be discussed in the post-Soviet period, that was also one, I would say, like one, not the only one, but one of the mechanisms of consolidating or historical point around which identity was consolidated. So just to kind of make it brief, many of you may have heard, you know, the description of Ukraine as a quote-unquote divided country between the more pro-Russian and sort of Russian-speaking east and south of the country, and the more pro-Western west and center of the country. Those of us who study Ukraine would tell you that, you know, that is really a simplification even before, you know, the events of 2014. But that be it as it may, it is certainly true that in the post-Soviet period in Ukraine, there was both linguistic and ethnic diversity and diversity of attitudes. And what it actually translated into, there were sort of two things important to keep in mind. First of all, we actually see, even before conflict begins in 2014, this border between quote-unquote pro-Russian and pro-Western Ukraine shifting gradually to the West. You can start by looking at election results from 1991 to subsequently, and we see sort of pro-Western parties advocating more Ukrainian national identity, not tied to Russia, European orientation, gradually make inroads in the center and eventually the East. At the same time, there was still substantial number of sort of Russia-friendly electorate, we can say, in the South and the South and the East. So when Yanukovych, pro-Russian president, was overthrown in the popular protests known as Euromaidan in 2014, and Putin, this is when he essentially decides to start his first invasion by annexing Crimea and sponsoring separatism in Donbass. The goal of this enterprise was supposedly to prevent Ukraine from leaving Russia's sphere of influence and drifting to the West. And the great irony of this is it's actually accelerated Ukraine's moving towards the West in its identity, in its attitudes, in its electoral politics, on all of these dimensions. So it is really fundamentally ironic that by preventing what he supposedly was trying to prevent, Putin actually made Ukraine more anti-Russian and more pro-Western, and that process, of course, now continues at a heightening speed as this current invasion unfolds. So just to give a little bit more context, for example, when Crimea was annexed and separatism started in these quasi-republics in eastern Donbass, that removed about 12% of the voting population from Ukrainian voter rolls because these people no longer voted in Ukrainian elections. Ukrainian politics, unlike Russian politics, has been very competitive in the 1990s and subsequently. Presidents regularly lost elections. It wasn't, of course, perfect democracy, but it was a competitive electoral process. So, and had Putin done nothing in 2014, it is very likely that, more pro-Russian candidate would have probably won the next round of presidential elections, because this is what was happening in Ukraine. Whoever came to power invariably disappointed voters with, lack of progress on economic reforms, anti-corruption, and so forth, and then would get punished and sort of more, would be replaced by somebody supported by another part of the country. So this alternation between pro-Western, pro-Russian presidents have been going on. My analysis would be that it would have continued had Putin not done what he done. And after he annexed Crimea and started the separatism in Donbass, two things happened. One, as I already said, numerically, pro-Russian electorate shrunk just because these people were no longer part, of the voting public. And also, very importantly, the attitudes shifted to more against Russia and for the West in the parts of the country that historically have been more Russia-friendly. If we look at opinion polls after 2014, on all of these dimensions, say membership in the European Union as opposed to Russia-led customs union, support for certain kind of memory politics that interpret Soviet past differently, which angers Putin very much, right? Support for NATO even. NATO never had more than 20-25% support at best before 2014. So not only NATO had no desire to admit Ukraine, there was never consensus in it. So I think NATO is really a red herring here. But even within Ukraine, that would not have passed any kind of referendum. And now that's a different story. So before invasion, I think for the first time, I have a colleague in the UK who does this regular polling with other colleagues. They found out for the first time ever in the south and east of the country, more people supported membership in NATO than were opposed to it. That's completely unheard of, and Putin can take credit for this, ironic as it is. Now, of course, now that we have this bloody war that has been unleashed on the population, and here again goes to Putin's, I think, deep misunderstanding of Ukraine, this belief that somehow Ukrainians and Russians are really one people, that they are oppressed by quote-unquote Nazi government, that opinion polls that have been presented cannot be trusted because people are afraid to express their pro-Russian preferences. By all accounts, he seems to believe this. I don't know what evidence he's getting, how he processes this evidence. We can talk about sort of COVID isolation or his own mindset given his history in the KGB and so forth. But he clearly dismissed, and there are records of this from his own answers to these questions at Valdai summits and others. So he's now bombing these people in Eastern Ukraine who are Russian speakers who are supposed to greet the Russians as liberators. And we see a groundswell of absolute determination to resist, of hatred towards Russians. At this point, it reached that. So, and the process basically of Ukrainian identity consolidation continues, because if there was now any kind of difference between East and West that was there, I would say by this point is gone. People who fight for Ukrainian side, they speak Russian as well as Ukrainian. So any sort of like linguistic language being a divide in Ukraine is gone. I think going forward, some interesting processes began already in the Orthodox Church. There are two churches in Ukraine, Orthodox churches. One is independent and one is in unity with Moscow. Of course, Moscow Church endorsed this invasion. So there is now really reckoning going on within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy. And I wouldn't be surprised if when all this is said and done, we will actually see unification of the last divide, well, one of the last societal divides in Ukraine, which is these Orthodox churches. So, as crazy as it is, Putin is really shooting himself in the foot. I mean, I want to stop now because I don't want to dominate the time. We can talk about possible outcomes. I don't think there is a path to victory for Putin here. There is a path to quick defeat and long defeat. I don't see how he can possibly achieve his stated objective of quote unquote denazifying Ukraine and turning it into some sort of puppet state. But I'll leave it at that because I think that's a little bit different question than identity itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Our next speaker is a valued colleague, a member of the Villanova faculty, the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, Father Joseph Loya. And Father Loya will introduce himself and then follow up on one of the themes that Oksana just mentioned, namely the role of religion and the Orthodox Church in both history and in contemporary Ukraine and Russia. Father Joe. Joe, you need to unmute yourself.
I would like to express my appreciation at being honored to be part of this august gathering. I would introduce myself as a professed Augustinian. I am also a rare Augustinian. I'm not Roman Catholic, but I'm an ordained Eastern Byzantine Catholic priest. I started here at Villanova in 1979. I am most honored to be serving as director of the Russian Area Studies Concentration Program from 2015 to present. I teach the course Religion in Russia for the program, and I am indeed, again, privileged to be here. I'd like to preface my presentation by just commenting on the title of the series. This particular subject is not so much of a turning point. Turnings can be long and drawn out. I think this is more of an inflection point. Inflection point is a complete instant turning of a whole direction, for example, from concave to convex. I think people are learning through this past week just how terribly profound and important the study of Eastern Europe is. That's one introductory remark I would like to make. For my task at hand on religion, focusing on church and state relations through the history of Ukrainian-Russian relations. Going back to the beginning is always a good place to start. Going back to 988, the conversion of Vladimir the Great, the Grand Prince of Eastern Slavs, known as the Rus, an ethno-national grouping comprising present-day Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians. The conversion was from nature worship, religious worldview to Christianity, but a particular kind of Christianity. The East Slavs entered into the realm of Eastern Byzantine Empire, which was ordered by the ideal of symphony, symphonia, harmony between church and state. For the next quarter century, from 988 to 1242, Kiev was the seat of Holy Kievan Rus. Kiev being the home of the head of state, the Grand Prince, and also the church's ruling bishop. As was mentioned, that the Grand Prince and bishop, state and church, work in harmony according to the Byzantine ideal. If you prefer an organic rather than musical metaphor, Holy Rus was the body of the state or rather the state was the body of Holy Rus, and the church served as Holy Rus's soul. So you have church and state, body and soul, with the separation of body and soul being the very definition of death, not only for an individual, but for this and all other faith-based geopolitical religious organisms. May I call, please, for the showing of the map of early Kiev and Rus, please. Thank you. Viviana, are you there?
Dana, can you launch the PowerPoint, please? Thanks.
Thus, Kiev and Rus in the 11th century. Notice that Moscow is not on that presentation. At this time, Moscow was pretty much, the area of Moscow was a wooded hinterland populated by wolves and bears. We see Kiev, if you can locate that, as the seat of church and state. Thank you. Today, both Russia and Ukraine claim Holy Rus as the womb from which their statehoods were born. I present to you, thank you, a statue erected recently, commissioned in 2014 after Russia claimed Crimea from Ukraine. It was inaugurated on 4 November 2016, National Unity Day, a national holiday revived by President Putin in 2005. Historical note, Vladimir the Great was baptized in Crimea. So this statue is read as Putin's making the statement, Crimea and its history is Russian history. Saint Vladimir is Russia. All of Ukraine and its history is Russian history. Back to our early story. In the mid-13th century, Kiev was devastated by the Mongol horde. In the early 14th century, both the Grand Prince and the Eastern Orthodox head bishop relocated from Kiev to the then upcoming Moscow, and Holy Muscovy served as the heir to Holy Kiev and Rus. Now we make the giant step into the current situation. In the mid-1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, both Russia and Ukraine adopted constitutions that mirror the Western liberal democratic ideals of freedom of religion and the separation between the state and all religions considered equal in the eyes of the state. Ukraine still holds to this liberal democratic ideal. But since the late 1990s, 1997 to be exact, Russia has been castigated for backtracking on its own constitution by legally privileging the Russian Orthodox Church, this in recognition of its prominent role in Russia's history and culture. Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism are recognized as traditional religions of Russia of a second rank, with other religious bodies being subjected to sometimes onerous state registration and oversight to the point of outright liquidation should the state feel it fit. And now to the religious scene in Russia and Ukraine today. 4 major players, leading players, And we'll see how, just make a brief comment on how they interrelate or do not interrelate. First of all, the Russian Orthodox Church, by far the largest of the 15 Orthodox local national churches. Over 60% of Russians, about 110 million, identify with being Russian Orthodox under the Patriarch of Moscow. With the next picture, please, you could see a presentation of, well, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let it be. Just acknowledge that church and state have each other's ears, at least here. Christian Mamo, writing for Emerging Europe, posits that the Russian Orthodox Church serves the state as a soft power to sell Russia's state narratives and influence people to support Russian state actions. That's how closely they are bound. Number two, there is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. The Patriarchal Bishop of Moscow has stationed in Kiev a loyal bishop of metropolitan rank, one rank lower than that of the head Patriarchal Bishop of Moscow. Of the Ukrainian population of 44 million, I would suppose, by my reckoning, about 17 million profess to identify with this church in Ukraine under Moscow. Third, we have the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Newly minted in 2018, others would argue that it is just re-established rather than newly established. But this is a church of Ukrainians for Ukrainians. Totally self-standing, governing, and independent of the Moscow Patriarchate. Next slide, please. Here is Vladimir Zelensky with Metropolitan Epiphany of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. There is a live opinion among Russian Orthodox that the American State Department conspired to set up this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine to weaken the unity of the Russian Orthodox Church and thereby weaken Russia. In 2018, Putin warned that any transference of allegiance and or property from the Ukrainian church under Moscow to the self-standing Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that could be cause for bloodshed. I figure maybe 10 million, 10.6 million of Ukrainian Orthodox belong to this church. And then finally, the Ukrainian Catholic Church. The Catholics, like myself, don't identify with the Ukrainian wing of the Russian Orthodox Church, not with the head of the new Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but with the Pope of Rome, which makes us Catholic. Ukrainian Catholics total about 4 million in number in Ukraine. I'd like to close and then summarize and close with a quote from Reverend Dr. John Chryssavikis, who recently in Public Orthodoxy, a publication of the Orthodox Christian Study Centers of Fordham University, he wrote in his essay, An Orthodox Christian Standing with Ukraine. To quote, "The reality is that the Orthodox churches have abysmally neglected over the centuries to instruct or inspire their congregations in a way that meaningfully influences and shapes civil society about assuming a stand before social political challenges or standing up to failures of a broken state. The truth is that through most of history, they have painfully succumbed or perversely submitted to the state, hardly disposed or competent to stand beside a laity exposed to the church's impotence and the state's ignorance. How tragic that it was left to the fearless protesters in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and elsewhere in Russia to expose them." Bottom line, Putin is not Russia. The Orthodox bishops aren't the church. The past is replete with shining, inspiring instances of Orthodox clergy and laity tapping into the reservoir of the best of their faith and thereby spoke truth to power, exercised the virtue of Pichalovanya or advocacy in behalf of the needy, oppressed, and victims of injustice. In these harrowing times, may loyal Russian citizens and faithful members of the Russian Patriarchate find that voice and that virtue yet again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Joe. Our next and final panelist before we then go into general discussion among the panelists is Lucy Minicozzi-Wheeland, a graduate of Villanova's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, first Russian Area Studies major, who spent a year and a half truncated by, unfortunately, COVID-19 as a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine, specifically in Odessa. And Lucy, I will ask you to continue to introduce yourself, and then Lucy will give us a perspective of someone from a younger generation who has many friends and contacts in Ukraine and who is an expert, a rising expert on Ukrainian history, politics, and culture. Lucy.
Thank you so much, Dean Lindenmeyr. So I wanted to quickly mention I was only in Ukraine for 7 months, not a year and a half, but I would have loved to be there for a year and a half if I could have. So yes, I from 2019 to 2020, I was a Fulbright student researcher based in Odessa. As Dean Lindenmeyr said, before that, I graduated from Villanova with a degree in Russian Area Studies, Global Interdisciplinary Studies, Russian Area Studies. And now I'm a second-year master's student at Harvard in Regional Studies, Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, where I really specialize particularly on Ukraine. I study Russian and Ukrainian languages. I am an aspiring expert on Ukraine, rising expert, as Dean Lindenmeyr said, still working on the expert part. But I do have quite a lot of close friends and colleagues who are in Ukraine. I know people in Odessa, Lviv, Kyiv. I know people in Kharkiv, Dnipro. I have connections all over. I was applying to spend another year in Ukraine starting in September. So I have a lot of connections that I've formed with people in Kharkiv, Dnipro, and even more so in Odessa, where those were the cities I was going to be in. Hopefully still will in the future, still want to do that. So we will see. So the few points I just briefly wanted to make that I feel I can contribute are kind of lessons I've learned from Ukrainian friends and colleagues who I've gotten to know, and things that I've seen firsthand. So for example, naturally, I spent the most amount of time when I was in Ukraine in Odessa, which is traditionally thought to be a Russian-speaking city. And I've done a lot of interviews with people in Kharkiv and Dnipro as well, which are both also thought to be Russian speaking. I'm writing my thesis partially about Donetsk and Luhansk as well. So with all that out of the way, basically a point that I really wanted to make, which is Putin claimed in his speech where he was justifying Ukraine, that he was going to invade Ukraine, as that the Ukrainian government was committing genocide against Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And this is flat out lunacy. I know so many people personally who are Russian-speaking Ukrainians. They live in the East, they live in the South, and they have told me they have never once felt discriminated against as Russian speakers. They are Ukrainians, they are patriotic, they are not Russians. Like, being a Russian-speaking Ukrainian is its own thing. It's a Ukrainian thing. It's part of being Ukrainian is that there are people in Ukraine who speak Russian, and that's totally fine. It is not like basically the people who I've talked to and who I've interviewed for my project at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, they do not want Russian protection, even if that protection didn't come in the form of bombing civilians. So that was a point that I wanted to make. Something else related to language is that Ukrainian is the official language of Ukraine. So I don't want to understate that, like, the amount of people that do speak Ukrainian. Most people I know who speak Russian also speak Ukrainian. And they, like I said, they're very much Ukrainians. It's not like, they themselves consider themselves Ukrainians. A lot of people as well, to show that the dividing line between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers isn't really divided, is that many people speak a language called Syriac, which is a combination of Ukrainian and Russian. I know someone from Luhansk who studied, he went to college at Donetsk National University, and he said in the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, that's more Russian speaking. But if you go even a few miles outside the city to the village where he grew up, they're speaking Ukrainian or Syriac. So it's not, I don't know. The language issue in Ukraine is so much more complicated than people think it is, and so much more simple than people think it is. So I feel like the bottom line that I wanted to make in that regard is literally just that, Putin doesn't have a leg to stand on when it comes to saying that he needs to defend Russian speakers. So if you're interested in hearing some of the personal perspectives I've gotten from people, you can look on the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute website under Voices from Ukraine. Shameless plug for that project. And something else that I wanted to say that Oksana already talked about was basically that a lot of analysts and scholars and other people talk about Ukraine being divided, but this is actually very outdated and misleading based on my research and from all the people I know. Sure, there are some regional, political, and linguistic differences across the country. It's a very big country. There's a lot of different regions where people might be divided on certain issues, but there's not really that Western Central group and that Southeastern group. It's not really hard and fast divided like that. And even if there were those divisions, there might be people who are pro-Russian in Ukraine. There are, but I think that it doesn't necessarily mean that the people who were let's cooperate more with Russia, let's not completely sever ties with Russia. This is before this. I should clarify. I am talking about before this invasion. Let's say there were those people, and there were. That has completely changed now. And basically, I'm gonna mention a few specific stories that I've pulled from interviews that I've done, and also cite some survey data to show that since 2014, the annexation of Crimea, Putin's war in Ukraine has united Ukrainians in a way that is unprecedented. Any divisions that were there in the country before 2014 have faded, and it's created a greater sense of Ukrainian unity and Ukrainian national identity. And I think that is even more so now. I think I would even argue that based on the people I'm talking to and the research I'm doing, I, in my opinion, feel that Putin has lost Ukraine forever by doing this. I don't think that Ukrainians are ever going to forget this. So one thing, for example, some people I've interviewed in Odessa and in Kharkiv, they've talked about, and from all over the country, have talked about being more proud of their country than ever before. They're proud of their armed forces, and they are extremely proud of Zelensky, who, you know, at one point he did face protests. He was not he was very popular when he was elected, but his approval rating has gone up and down like any other president. And now people are extremely proud of Zelensky for what he's doing and what he's standing up for. And many of these people who I've interviewed are Russian speakers. They express they've never experienced the oppression, let alone genocide, that Putin claims is happening. And these people who I've interviewed even say they despise Putin, and they call the Russians who have invaded their country invaders, monsters, inhuman. So this is my point that I'm making. And I have statistics as well to support this narrative that's emerging. Rating Sociological Group, which is a Ukrainian non-governmental polling organization, found a few days ago that 86% of Ukrainians now support accession to the EU and 76% support joining NATO. And that represents a 20% increase regarding EU accession and a 14% increase regarding NATO membership since just a few days before the invasion started. Also, Zelensky's approval ratings have increased from 50% to 93% since early February. 98% of respondents now support the activities of the Ukrainian armed forces, and 88% believe that Ukraine will be able to win against Russia. So this is my point that I'm making through both personal stories and work I'm doing and statistics and polling that have been collected, is that Ukrainians are united in a way that they have never been before. And I think if Putin was expecting to find a nation that is going to welcome him when he invades it, he has been sorely misled. I don't really know what he was thinking, but he has effectively done exactly the opposite of what he wanted to do. So I'm sorry, that was a bit long. Thank you all very much.
No, thank you very much, Lucy. I'm going to attempt very briefly to summarize what I perceive to be some major points that our panelists have made. And then I have a couple of topics or questions that I would like to ask them. I see we also have a couple of questions already in the chat, and we'll get to those in, I would say, about 5 to 10 minutes. So first, to try to summarize some important points that our panelists have made. First of all, the very long history of imperial relations between Russia as the metropole and Ukraine, or Little Russia as it was known in the days of the Russian Empire. That this is not some new episode in Russian-Ukrainian relations, but a very, very long historical trajectory of Russia seeking to control and absorb Ukraine. Second, we have been enlightened, I think, about the important role played by language and also by religion in the very long and complicated history of relations between Ukraine, which was for hundreds of years part of the Russian Empire and then the USSR, only recently independent. And there are strong ties of language and religion, but also real breaks in those cultural ties. I think also our panelists have reminded us of the importance of 2014. Almost exactly this time in 2014, Russia invaded with its little green men and annexed through a manufactured referendum Ukraine, which had been Crimea, which had been part of Ukraine since 1954, and made it part of Russia, even though it is separated by many, many, many kilometers from the Russian border. This constituted, certainly in Ukrainian political history, a major turning point. So those are just a few of the themes: religion, invasion, empire, language, that I see our panelists bringing to the fore. I would also like then to ask our panelists to talk, if they would, about economic relations between Russia and Ukraine, and in particular, whether Ukraine is perceived, as it has been in the past, as having economic value to Russia. I wonder if anybody would be interested in addressing that briefly. Lynn, Oksana, any economic angle that we should be aware of?
Well, I can start. I mean, I think given what's going on, economic issues sort of by default take, secondary position. But Ukraine, I mean, certainly has economic value for Russia and for the world globally, not least because of the food production, right? I mean, this is one of the crises, like one of the possible reverberation of this crisis, of this current crisis, is what might happen to the global food supply if the war continues into the spring sowing season, because Ukraine supplies a lot of wheat and corn. I can't remember the exact percent, but it's just a substantial global percent. There are already reports what implications it might have for food security in poorer parts of the world. So if anybody, thinks that this conflict somehow doesn't have broader implications, that would be one thing, right? Now, another thing I would mention about the economy, that Russia has used, especially its energy resources, as a weapon, as a foreign policy instrument against the countries in its neighborhood. And one of the things that we had seen was a decision that post-Soviet countries had to make, some early after 1991, some later on. Do they want to be dependent on Russian energy and therefore also be subjected to greater Russian political influence, right? Or do they want to experience some economic pain and kind of disconnect from the dependency on Russia? And here is Ukraine sort of an interesting case, because in the 90s, there was no desire, partly because of political divisions, but also partly because of economic crises, to basically experience this pain, economic pain of disconnecting, or at least limiting the dependence on Russian energy. And we had seen that happen at a greater pace since 2014. Of course, the whole Nord Stream that has now been paused was a way, for Russia, but we can say in some way, to punish Ukraine once it cut its both political and economic ties. But some other countries, say like the Baltic states, have cut this dependency earlier on and were able to pursue more independent foreign policy. It came at a cost, economically, and some countries like Belarus continue to be fully dependent. And in a way, we see Belarusian sovereignty has been greatly eroded to the point that, it's now used as a staging ground for Russian invasion into Ukraine. And of course, the resources that its authoritarian president Lukashenko gets allowed him to stay in power and crush the protests. So I think, these are sort of broader economic issues I would put on the table.
Thank you, Oksana. Lynn, anything you would like to say on maybe the historical economic relationship between Russia and Ukraine, or don't mean to put you on the spot, but.
That's okay. I would just say one thing. I mean, one of the most egregious parts of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine does come in the late 1920s and early 1930s with Stalin's attempt to collectivize agriculture. And I think here we see again the the colonial feeling of entitlement displayed by Moscow towards Ukraine. Stalin, as he started to begin collectivization, looked at Ukraine as his own personal breadbasket and just tried to extract as much as he could from the area. When the Ukrainians resisted the efforts to collectivize agriculture, Stalin reacted violently against them. In I think it was just the first few months of 1930, there were over 100,000 Ukrainians forcibly deported from their homes to places in Central Asia, Siberia, by the Urals without any resources. When Ukrainians continued to resist attempts to collectivize their agriculture, Stalin looked at it as a demonstration of Ukrainian nationalism that had to be silenced. And I think in many ways, his violent reaction in the imposition of blacklists and basically closing off Ukrainian villages that were not meeting the astronomical quotas that he imposed upon them, demonstrate how I think economics and power and violence in the hand of an authoritarian or totalitarian or dictator can be used to exploit the people for whatever ends they imagine.
Thank you, Lynn. And one more theme that I would just like to bring up briefly, and maybe Lucy put you on the spot, and that is the influence and power of historical memory on shaping recent Ukrainian-Russian relations and also the current moment. I'm thinking in particular of two major moments, quite different, but equally tragic in the 20th century. The Holodomor that Professor Chevelle mentioned, the manufactured famine mainly in Ukraine in the 1930s, and the impact of that historical tragedy on contemporary Ukrainian consciousness. And then also the continued powerful influence of World War II on both Russian and Ukrainian conceptions of their power and their relationship to the rest of the world. Lucy, in your interactions and relationships with Ukrainians today, are those events still influential as historical memories on the way people perceive and act in this crisis?
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up. I'm afraid this isn't totally my area. I'm not as familiar with 20th century Ukrainian history, but I can say a theme that I've seen recently, especially with people I know online and who I've interviewed, that they reference historical Russian oppression of their country, and that this is just, for example, the Holodomor, perfect example of a genocide that was committed against Ukrainians by the Soviet government, a man-made famine. And I feel like, based on what I have seen, this invasion is just another in a list of ways that the Russian state has oppressed Ukraine. And this is coming from people I've talked to, that they talk about how, their poets have been murdered, they've been invaded, they've been killed through famine, and that, they're saying no more, that this is the end of that. They are going to fight to the end. So that is, I'm afraid that doesn't directly answer your question. I'm just speaking from.
Actually, it does.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to move quickly on now to some of the questions that people have put into the chat. The first one from our colleague Dave Barrett in political science. The reports that the CIA and other US intelligence agencies had, that they were highly confident that a Russian invasion of Ukraine was coming soon, had little impact on Ukrainian public opinion. So Dr. Barrett asks, did these news reports of 3 or 4 weeks ago lead you to believe that an invasion was imminent? Maybe I'll ask you, Professor Chevelle, when in the lead up to the invasion, what did you anticipate was going to happen? Did it come as a surprise to you?
Yes, well, I think I wouldn't be the only one, and Professor Hartnett already said that. I think people who study the region were quite skeptical, of many people, of these intelligence reports that invasion was imminent, exactly because this war makes absolutely no sense, right? So things such as, say, this hoax about NATO, and that actually speaks to a few other questions that were about NATO in that chat. So a couple of things I think are important to keep in mind there. First of all, it's not that NATO expanded kind of on its own force, right? It's these countries who were former Soviet bloc countries begged NATO to let them in. I think Poland at some point threatened to develop nuclear weapons if it wasn't let in. And that's exactly because they feared Russian imperialism, the exact same behavior we see now, right? So if before these, smaller countries were called sort of paranoid, right? Like think about it. What would happen to Estonia had it not been in NATO, right? But so what I want to say that this was sort of one of the reasons Ukraine's membership in NATO was a no-go. It was like we can enumerate multiple reasons from no consensus within NATO, including from big powers like France and Germany. Orban of Hungary, who was going to veto any kind of path to NATO, he was already vetoing various forms of cooperation, right? Territorial dispute that already existed within Ukraine over Crimea and Donbass. So the idea that what they're saying now, I mean, it sort of reached the narrative reached complete perversion that now in Russia, they're arguing that they're fighting in self-defense. So had they not invaded, NATO would have invaded them through Ukraine. I mean, this is complete lunacy. So I don't think we should be amplifying or giving credence, to this. We can sort of analyze, causes of Russian, of the NATO expansion, this and that, but this somehow offers any justification. Like, I think that argument holds no water. Now, sort of going back to the Ukrainian, what did people think? I think exactly because for these reasons, it made no sense to anybody, right? So Putin acted, I think, on his fantasies about both Ukraine and NATO. If you read his pre-invasion speech, he talks about things that, like, he literally says that NATO controls every municipality in Ukraine, every platoon in the Ukrainian army, that they're planning to put some sort of ballistic missiles in some provincial airports that were refurbished with EBRD money and aim them at Moscow. This is like a fantastical thing, right? So I think within Ukraine, this is why I think up until the very end, most people did not believe it's going to happen. Right. That said, I think preparation behind the scene was going on because Ukrainians were receiving weapons. The army, it's still holding 12 days later because, it has been in some way prepared. But I think because this decision is so irrational, right, and the aims are so unreachable, that I think that's why Zelensky probably didn't want to create, panic earlier on. And I think decision, was really a single-handed decision by Putin. So he had a way out. He was claiming all this way that he had the military exercises, right? He could have ended with the annexation of these separatist republics that Russia de facto controlled already, right? So you don't really need to start a war over it. You could just, when Putin declared, that he's annexing these republics, many people, myself included, thought sort of like, that's probably where it's going to end, right? And then, of course, it didn't. So I think these are the things to keep in mind.
Thank you. And that you've also addressed several questions in the chat that have to do with the role of NATO expansion in creating or influencing this crisis. And I think you have given us a very brief, concise history of NATO expansion that I think undermines the position we hear occasionally that the United States or NATO is somehow responsible for bringing Russia to the point of invasion because of the expansion, the inclusion of formerly Eastern European bloc countries into NATO. Moving to another perspective, one of our attendees wrote, dictators and autocrats depend on the military to survive. As the ruble continues to decline and Russian soldiers realize that their pay is not what it was, is it reasonable to expect a complete revolution in Russia to bring down Putin? If so, what would the timetable be? Boy, if I knew the answer to that question, I could really rule the world. Lynn, let's look at Russian military history for some insight into this question, and also the history of Russian protest and anti-government action in general. Looking at that history, what do you think is the likelihood of a more significant Russian resistance to this invasion than what we've seen so far?
Well, I'm with you in saying, that's the question that we all want the answer to. I will say this, for so long when I would teach Russian history, and I would use the experience of Russian autocracy as kind of a foil to the development of liberalism and democracy. And my students would always say, well, why didn't they just have a revolution, right? Why didn't they just revolt? It's a really complicated thing to do, right? There are a lot of variables in play, and especially when rulers have imposed the types of restrictions and oppression and censorship that we've seen accelerate in Russia under Putin, and that we saw in earlier periods. That being said, the Russian Revolution of 1917 came on the heels of a war, and the idea that the government was unable to successfly continue to prosecute that. Same thing with the 1905 revolution. 1991 was a different state. I mean, there was no the state of affairs. There was no shots fired. There was no, no protests in the streets. The empire just collapsed. I don't know. One of the things that bothers me so much about this is I don't see how we end this. To Oksana's point, I think before this happened, I just kept thinking we just have to give, if Putin has some kind of off-ramp that he can claim was a victory before the Russian people, that it won't go any further. I think we're past that point. And so I'm hopeful that perhaps the Russian soldiers, most of whom are conscripts and are woefully underpaid, and as the ruble declines are becoming more so, will, stand up and not bomb civilian populations in Ukraine. But I don't know. The one thing I will say too, most revolutions that have happened in the past, although the events on the front play into the success of the revolutions themselves are located in the centers of power. And so, I think we need to continue to look at the movements in Russian cities, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, primarily, and look at those who are closest to Putin. But surely, I think if there's any chance of this the ship being righted, the Russian military will have to play a role.
Thank you, Lynn. That was a big question to pose to you on the spur of a moment. I'm going to turn now to another Villanova colleague, Dr. Michael Westrate, Assistant Vice Provost for Graduate Education and Research, who himself is a fellow Russian historian. We have a relatively large number of them at Villanova, and who is going to tell us about where we might be able to help, certainly help refugees. And so, Michael, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dean Lindenmeyr. I'll go quickly. So for those of you who are still here, if we can bring that slide back, that'd be great. Thank you. That was perfect. I did put the links in the chat, But right now, the White House has provided temporary protective status for the 30,000 odd Ukrainians in the United States, which is great. But we're lagging far behind Europe and Canada in providing refugee status for new folks to come to the United States. We're now up over 1.7 million displaced Ukrainians, and it's going up at over 150,000 additional folks a day. So one of the things that I would recommend is if you support the United States accepting some of these refugees, email the White House. They have a little form, and just say you want temporary protective status and or refugee status for additional Ukrainians to come to the United States, including travel authorization. So the difference between TPS and refugee status is TPS does not provide a path to citizenship and residency. Refugee status does. And then in terms of donating, a lot of folks have been asking, knowing the corruption levels in Eastern Europe, where would be some good places to donate? My recommendation right now, in addition to Catherine Stesic, who works with me and has a lot of connections within the Ukrainian American community, is Razom, which translates as Together for Ukraine. You just Google Razom for Ukraine, or the link is in the chat. I know the organization Samaritan's Purse, which is an American evangelical organization that has a network of over 2,000 churches in Ukraine and has started relief aid. They are a legitimate charity. Just Google Samaritan's Purse Ukraine. And then one of our graduate students in political science here at Villanova, Katerina Minkina, has recommended the Ukrainian Association of Washington State, where Fulbrighters going both directions have banded together. So Lucy and I are both Fulbrighters that did our Fulbrights in Ukraine. And Fulbrighters have banded together to do this organization. And that's on PayPal, Ukrainian Association of Washington State. And then if you want more, the Ukrainian Education and Cultural Center in Jenkintown here in Pennsylvania has done a big list of vetted organizations where you can donate. So thank you very much for that opportunity, Dean Lindenmeyr.
Thank you very much, Michael. I know there are more questions in the chat. They have a lot of them to do with the NATO question and US's role. And I regret to say that we really don't have any more time to devote to those questions in this panel, where we've tried to give you a very long and broad historical perspective on the events that are unfolding so tragically in Ukraine. I do want to let you know of two upcoming events at Villanova. One of them you actually have to be physically present at Villanova to participate in, but the other will be a virtual event. First of all, this Thursday, March 10th, Father Loya has organized a time of gathered solemn silence, followed by an ecumenical prayer for peace. This is a joint initiative by our Russian Area Studies program and Villanova's campus ministry. It will take place once again on Thursday at 3:45 on the steps of Core Hall for those of you who are at Villanova. So that's Thursday, 3:45 p.m. On March 29th, we have a virtual event we're very excited about. We organized it beginning last December, never imagining that it would become even more important. And that is a conversation with Lucy and Kim. If you are an addict of NPR, as I am, that name is familiar to you. Mr. Kim is the NPR Moscow bureau chief from 2016 until just last year, and currently a resident fellow at the Kennan Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. So Mr. Kim is going to lead us in a conversation at the end of March, the title of which is Russia in the Headlines, you are more than welcome and encouraged to sign up. You need to register for the Zoom event, and that information you can find on the Russian Area Studies website, Villanova University's website. I want to thank our panelists from the bottom of my heart for their willingness to participate this evening and to give us the benefit of their deep and broad experience and knowledge, and their willingness to answer some very difficult and unanticipated questions. My sincere thanks to all of the audience for spending a bit of your evening with us. I hope it's been enlightening, and let us all pray for peace as soon as possible. Good night, everyone.